Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar on developing a study plan for how to, study effectively for the GRE. It says 8 weeks, but to some extent, this is kind of adaptable. Now, at this point, I'm still waiting for some people to join in. I think that, we want to give everyone an opportunity to sign in, get through all of the technical gremlins, and then we can get started. So, hopefully we should be able to get started by 7:40, maybe even 7:38 proper. And we can, in the meantime, discuss a little bit about, the rules and the structure for this webinar so that it is conducted in the most efficient manner possible so that, we make the best use of our time. So, just to give you all a little bit of a sense of what's to come. Ideally, we want to be done in 60 minutes. Sometimes it could take a little bit longer, but that is what it is. 60 minutes would be ideal, right? If we can get through that effectively. A few ground rules, right? Ultimately, what we're trying to make sure of is that there's several of you on your end and just me on my end. So in order to make sure communication happens effectively, we have a system in place. And I'd strongly request you to adhere to this system. Otherwise, it's not just difficult for me, but it puts a strain on everybody else who's here and their time constraints as well. So just keep that in mind. Couple of things, right? So I may ask you, just casual questions, or, you may have something to say to me at times. If you wish to do this, you can open up the chat window. So there is a chat window, and on the chat window, you can type in whatever you wish to communicate to me. I'd like to test this out so that we know that it's working, right? So if you're able to use the chat window to send a message, please type in the message 1. If you're not able to do it or you feel like there's some trouble, well, try to type in 2, but if you don't, you don't. So try typing in 1, try sending the message just with the number 1 so that I can confirm that, it works on your end. Okay, I see a few 1s coming in, that's great. So I'm going to test things out like this. We'll use 1 for yes and 2 for no. If you play video games online, you may already be familiar with this kind of communication strategy. But yeah, 1 for yes, 2 for no. If you find that you are that I'm not clear, or that you're not able to hear me, or there's some technical glitch, ping me on the chat window, and I'll ask everyone else whether there's a problem or not. If it turns out that multiple people have some kind of issue, well, that's probably something on my end. But if it's just you, then it may be something that you need to work out from your end, right? So, having said all of that, right? Couple of other things. Yes, you shouldn't be able to see me at this point anyway. As long as you can see the screen, that's what works. That's what matters. A couple of other points, right? So if you have any direct questions for me and you don't want to put them on the chat, you can always put them in the Q&A section. There's also a button, on your screen which says raise hand, but please don't use raise hand. If you use it, I will not be able to respond to it. The way that things are set up, it simply does not work well for us. So if you have a question, put the question on chat or Q&A. Don't use raise hand. It simply doesn't work, right? Lastly, there's also a tab that you might be able to notice called polling. At various stages, I'm going to make certain, sort of polls available to you, and you can pick your answers for the polls, and that's just a fun exercise to make sure that you're engaged, and it's not just you sitting and hearing me drone on for like an hour or so, right? Okay, so it's 7:40, so let's get into it, right? Firstly, just to introduce myself, my name is Matoo. Right, I have a master's in economics from the University of Amsterdam. In fact, both of my degrees are in economics. But what I really like doing is I like taking standardized tests. And I realize that makes me sound like a massive nerd, and to some extent that's kind of true. But I do like standardized tests because there is a structure to them. If you understand how they work, you can beat them without necessarily being better at understanding the stuff that they ask you about. And that's what I really like about them. I like being better at something without actually necessarily being better. I like that I could find a way to game the system. And, I really get off on that. I really get off on believing that I can do this. So, that's something that I always liked. And, I did the things that you would do if you're good at standardized tests. I took the CAT, I prepared to go to business school, all of that jazz. But then I realized that, at the end of the day, that's all very well and good. What I really like is teaching. I have this knowledge, I have this understanding, and I would rather share this with people. That's, sort of what really gets me hyped to wake up in the morning. I'd say the only thing that gets me hyped to wake up in the morning. So for sure, that's something that will come through in my approach towards teaching all through. When I'm not teaching, I do enjoy cricket and football. I like hip hop music, very into history and philosophy and politics and all that stuff. And I like these kinds of academic pursuits. So certainly, you can call me a nerd, but I like what I like. All right, so that's a little bit about me, right? Now I'll tell you a little bit about Crack Birbal itself, right? So essentially, what we like to, at least, say that we do is that a lot of people claim to help out, or they claim to teach you for the test, and that's good. That's good. You want to learn for the test. But what we do differently is that we like to think that we assist you across the entire process. Deciding to do a master's is not just I need to do well on the GRE, or I need to send out my application essay. It's not just one of these things. And not only is it both of them, it's also a bunch of other things. You're making a big decision. You're probably the first person in your family to be making this decision as well, unless you have an older sibling. The chances that you're the first generation to be moving to another country to study is overwhelmingly high. So it's a meaningful decision, and it needs to be treated with that weight and importance. And this is something that we pride ourselves on doing exceptionally well. Before we dive into the content itself, we have a few resources that you can check out to help you get started. So you can access our trial course at online.crackbirbal.com/GRE. To check out what we have on offer, check out how we help you, get from point A to B when it comes to learning the content that you need to learn for the test. We also have various ebooks. So, if you go to crackbirbal.com/free-resources/ebooks, you'll find a large collection of various ebooks that, they're very short reads. They're not like full-on books, right? I think we understand that keeping your, your attention span up is harder and harder every day, right? I think that there's more things competing for our attention than ever before, and which require less commitment, right? It takes like 10 seconds to look at a funny meme. So, ultimately, these aren't very long books, but they're certainly helpful resources to give you a sense of what the challenge is and how to overcome. We also have a large corpus of YouTube videos. If you go check out youtube.com/user/crackbirbal videos, you'll find a large selection of the videos that we have on offer. And, it's all useful content, and it's all absolutely free. Something else that I do want to talk about that will come up later is that we do have, the selection of flashcards. And, these flashcards have been designed in a very specific manner. Most people give you a word list and they say, hey, okay, here's a list of words that you need to learn and memorize everything on the list. And, that's all very well and good, but it's not super effective, to be very honest. So, what we've come up with is a slightly different system. We use both visual and auditory cues to help you get to a sense of, what this word means. And what that does is it gives you context for the word. It gives you a sense of where you might use the word. And that context is invaluable when it comes to helping you actually answer questions with the GRE words that you're trying to learn, not simply learn words for the sake of learning them. There's a link over here that's been provided to, a selection of the flashcards, right? To check out, a few of them for free to see how it works. But we do have a total of 500 of them, and I believe that you can get them off of Amazon. Last but not least, we do have various blogs as well, right? Again, similar to ebooks, but a little bit smaller, a little bit more digestible, and the content being discussed is a little simpler as well, right? And it's a bit about strategy and tips that you can use to, help you take on whatever you need to do to, manage the GRE. All right, so let's dive in. Right, it's 7:45. As good a time to start with the content proper. I do see that there's something on the chat. It's a very generic question: how to do quants. So to be very honest with you, this is just what we're going to be covering here is a generic strategy, right? We're not going to really discuss many questions in depth. We're going to work on understanding how you need to think about the GRE itself. Because if you don't have that right, then all of your prep is not going to be useful. All of your prep isn't going to get you to where you want to go, right? A couple of points, by the way, about questions. You can put questions on in the chat and in the Q&A box, but I won't answer them immediately. What we're going to do is, I'll go over some of the content for the webinar. At certain points, we'll take a pause, and I'll answer all of the questions that come up in that time, and then we'll continue, right? So that's point one about the questions. Point two about the questions is that, please try to keep the questions as focused to the discussion that this webinar is about, right? Where we're going to talk about building a study plan. We're going to talk about the way to approach the GRE as an exam altogether. And what that means is that, it would be to everyone's benefit if the questions asked are primarily in that, in that milieu, in that structure, in that setup, right? Great. So let's get to it, right? So why are we all here anyway, right? Why are we all, you've all showed up on a Friday evening, right? You could have been out partying, but you decided to stay in. So, I applaud that decision. But why are you here? What are you trying to get out of it, right? We're trying to learn how the GRE works so that we can learn how to beat it. Now, ultimately, that's what we're trying to do no matter what, right? We're trying to understand how the GRE works so that we can beat the GRE. At the end of the day, you could say that, oh, we're trying to learn words, we're trying to learn how to solve questions, we're trying to learn verbal, we're trying to learn quant. All of that's true, but we're doing all of those things ultimately to understand how to beat the GRE. That's our goal, right, at the end of the day. So in order to do that effectively, we need to understand, one, how the GRE works. Two, we need to know how to beat it based on how it works. And three, we need to understand how to approach the exam and plan for the exam in a manner that makes sure that we do 1 and 2. If we don't get that out of the way, we can't really, get anything else done effectively. And then we might as well be talking about point 4, right? And thinking that, well, life is really kind of meaningless, and why are we doing any of this? No, we're doing this for a specific reason, right? We're doing this to understand how the GRE works, how to beat it, and how to come up with a plan that does points 1 and 2. Ultimately, if we can do that effectively, we should be in a good place. So how does one beat the GRE, right? How do we come up with a good plan? How do we come up with a plan that works? Now, to answer that question, I want to start by asking you another question, right? So I want you to imagine a situation here. You get told today, right? So I'm going to tell you right now that in 2 months' time, you're going to fight a gladiatorial battle, right? The gladiators are, the people who used to fight battles in ancient Rome, but not battles as part of a war. They were forced to fight battles for our entertainment. Blood sport seems like weird entertainment, but I guess that's what ancient Romans got up to. So let's imagine, right? You got to fight a gladiatorial battle. For those of you who aren't entirely sure, in a gladiatorial battle, you fight with a sword against somebody else with a sword to the death. All right, so it's a high stakes battle. It really matters. You really, really want to win, or else you're in trouble. Right? So you got to fight this battle. And at this point, you're not really prepared. You don't know how to use a sword, right? You don't know how to, do whatever you need to do in order to fight this battle, right? So what are you going to do? What are you going to do over the next 2 months, right? Next 8 weeks, right? That's what we've discussed for the study plan as well. How are you going to deal with this situation, and what are you going to do? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to open up poll number 1, right? So please go to the polling, page and the polling tab. And I've opened up poll number 1 and made it possible for you to answer it. It's the same question that you've been asked and you've been given 3 options. So please plug in an answer, right? I'll give you a minute to do so. And we will discuss the answers and we'll discuss sort of where we're trying to get at from this. All right, so it's been a minute now that the poll's open, and most of you have answered it, so I'm going to end it and we can discuss it. All right, so good that none of you picked the joke answer. I mean, I don't mind if you pick the joke answer, but it's nice that you already start with a positive attitude, right? You're not just going to give up and accept your fate. You're going to try to do whatever you can. So that's great. Now, among the remaining, 12 of you who answered this question, now one of you said that, you want to train nonstop to become the best fighter ever. And that's nice, that's admirable, and that's a good goal, right? You want to obviously try and be the best that you can be every single day. The problem is that this is kind of high stakes, right? And okay, you're not going to become the best gladiator, you're not going to become the best wielder of a sword, which incidentally is how the word gladiator came to be. Gladius in Latin means sword. So gladiators are those who fight with swords. A little bit of little tidbit and a bit of knowledge about a word that maybe you didn't know about. But okay, right? The problem is that you're not going to become the best gladiator in the world, right? However hard you try, and as much as you'd like, for the GRE as well, you're overcoming certain barriers that are going to be quite challenging. You may not necessarily be a native English speaker, and the verbal section is pretty challenging on this exam. You may not necessarily become the best at taking standardized tests in the world, but you still want to achieve the outcome that is necessary. At the end of the day, you may not necessarily become the best at doing this test. But what you can do, and what a lot of you sort of picked up on, even though the question was kind of loaded for that, is that ultimately what you want to do is understand your opponent. You want to know how your opponent fights. If you know that your opponent is left-handed or right-handed, that impacts the way that you're going to fight them. If you know whether your opponent prefers to do long thrusts or whether they prefer to do slashes and jabs, that could help you as well, right, in fighting a battle. So similarly, knowing the test, knowing your opponent, understanding what the GRE is all about and what it has in store for you is going to help massively when it comes to getting a sense of how to build your prep and what you want to achieve out of your prep. What is it that you're going to prep for and what you want to achieve out of it? All of that can be effectively done by understanding your opponent so that you know how to beat them, right? By understanding the test in order to beat the test, right? You know the test in order to beat the test. So to that end, I'm going to give you a little bit of information, very quickly blitz through it because this is information that you can look up anywhere and is hopefully information that you're already somewhat familiar with. But essentially, the GRE is composed of 6 sections. All right, so you have the analytical writing section. That's one section that's an hour long. It has 2 tasks, 30 minutes, back to back. You got to write 2 essays, in 30 minutes each, and then you move on from there. You then have 2 sections of verbal reasoning and 2 sections of quantitative reasoning. These sections can come in any order, by the way, so don't have any expectations of verbal quant, or quant verbal, or 2 quants and 2 verbals. No such thing, right? The sections can come in absolutely any order. And you have 20 questions in a section. And depending on whether it's verbal or quant, you have a slightly different amount of time. 30 minutes for the verbal, 35 minutes for the quant. Now, that, if your quick maths is sound, you may know that, well, that's 5 sections that we've covered, 1 AWA, 2 verbal, 2 quant. The 6th section is a section that is either unscored or research. It's one of the 2. So it's a section that is either just an unscored section that doesn't count towards your score, or it's a research section that still doesn't count towards your score, but the GRE is collecting your data to understand what kinds of questions are easy, medium, or hard. Right? So ultimately, there are 6 sections, right? Remember that the AWA section can be, the unscored or research section can be either verbal or quant. You won't know if it's verbal or quant. So all you'll see is 3 verbal and 2 quant, or 3 quant and 2 verbal. You got to do your best on every section, right? But keep this in mind, right? So you could get 3 verbal and 2 quant, or 3 quant and 2 verbal. That could change quite a bit, right? That changes a lot about what you spend more of your time doing, and that could also impact test difficulty. So this is a good example of how knowing the structure of the test, knowing what you're in for, will help you develop and prepare a proper plan. In addition to this, we could even say that, for example, the AWA section, you're going to write 2 essays in an hour, and then you're going to get into the part of your test that really contributes to your score. Why do you do 2 essays then? The GRE has put that in place to mess with you. And I'm being very honest here, they put it in place to mess with you, right? They may give you a whole bunch of other reasons, but it's there at the start so that it messes with your head and then you're thinking about the AWA. But now that you know that, now that you know how the test is set up, now that you know what the test is trying to do to you, you can reverse it. You can say, well, okay, I'm not going to let that happen because I know that that's what they've put in place. So I'm going to keep my cool and just continue with the test later, right? So 1 AWA, 1 essay section with 2 essays, and then you could have 3 verbals and 2 quants, or 3 quants and 2 verbals. Now in the verbal and quant sections, your score is a score that will range from 130 to 170, and you will get a whole number score. So it can be like 134, or it can be like 163, it can be like 155, right? But it can't be 155.5, right? So it's always going to be a whole number. With the AWA, you're scored separately altogether. It's a 0 to 6 score, and here you can have half points. You can't have quarter points though, but you can certainly have half points. And there you can see, right? The AWA is scored differently. It doesn't add up to your main score out of 340. Hence, the AWA is just there to mess with you, and that's something that you can work your way around, right? So remember that you're gonna have the verbal and quant sections give you a score out of 170 each. Ideally, then you have a max possible score of 340. For reference, when I took the GRE myself, my score was 336, right? So you could get a score anywhere from 260 to 340. Now that you know that, you could think about, well, what is realistic as a target? What is realistically achievable? What can I do based on my knowledge? How can I think about how I want to boost my score, right? One little tip about the test is that there's no negative marking. This is a good example, again, of like knowing the test to beat the test. In fact, I didn't know this. When I did the GRE, I didn't know that there was no negative marking. I didn't know that there was no guessing penalty. So there were 2 questions on the second verbal section that I didn't know the answer to, and I didn't feel comfortable, so I didn't guess. I felt, oh, if I guess and it's wrong, I could be affected. I shouldn't guess, and I didn't guess. Now, maybe I could have guessed them and not gotten them correct. But maybe I could have gotten 1 correct, right? Maybe I could have boosted my score further, right? So it's very important to remember that your knowledge of the mechanics of the test is going to help you beat the test at the end of the day. And that's what you want to be going for overall. All right, so let's dive into something that's kind of related, right? And on this front, what I want you to think about is, which of these sections do you think is the most challenging? It says, A quant, B verbal, C AWA. You know what? I think that on the poll itself, it's marked not in this order. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to mark this around the other way around. A verbal, B quant, C AWA. And I am going to open up poll number 2. So just like you did with poll number 1, I want you to answer poll number 2. I'll keep it open for a minute, and then we can discuss the answers. I see some votes are coming in already, so that's great. You can send your results in. All right. Poll's been open for a minute, so I'm going to end it. I think there was enough time for you to, get your answers in. And let's make the results available. So as I can see, 10 of you, 91% of you think that the verbal section is harder, and just 9% of you think that the quant section is harder. That's understandable, right? I think that as non-native English speakers, or certainly as even if you are a native English speaker, you're not in an environment maybe where where you're surrounded by native English speakers. So the verbal section is harder. The verbal section is a little bit more challenging, and I accept that. And over the course of this webinar, we will be looking a little bit more at certain verbal ideas than quant ones, just because that tends to be the requirement or the hope or the expectation of most people who come for these webinars, right? I don't want to feel like, if you found quant harder, I don't want you to feel like you're not included. Ultimately, the approach that we're looking at is the same, right? And none of this content is really different, whether it's verbal or quant. We just wanted to get a sense of where people are at and what the challenge is. In addition to this, it's good that you thought about this for a second, right? Maybe you already knew the answer to this, and then, I didn't need to ask you this question. But, it's good if you thought about this for the first time and you came to the conclusion that verbal was harder. That's good. That's good that you thought about it, because, knowing the test is one thing. You also got to know your own skills. You also got to understand, well, what am I good at and what am I bad at? And therefore, what do I need to improve on and what do I need to consolidate as a strength? So, it's a good idea to know that. It's a good point, worth knowing and worth thinking about. Now, that being said, you're still obviously going to have to study both verbal and quant. You may study more of one than the other, right? And I think that, if let's say you find the verbal section harder, you're probably going to spend, maybe twice the amount of time on verbal that you do on quant. If you spend an hour on verbal, maybe you'll spend half an hour on quant. If you spend 5 hours on verbal, maybe you'll spend 2.5 hours on quant, right? Or vice versa. But ultimately, you're going to have to still study both sections, right? You're still going to have to address both sections just to make sure you can do the best job that you possibly can. Now, how do you approach studying for these sections anyway, right? What do you need to do to make sure that you get good at verbal or that you get good at quant? Because there's a reason it's called verbal and not English. There's a reason it's called quant and not math, right? You're not studying English and math. You're studying a very different specific skill that's only really tested on this test. So what are you looking to achieve? Ultimately, your approach needs to be two-pronged. Right? Your approach needs to come from two angles. Your approach needs to address two different sides of the equation, right? And then only can it be a properly balanced approach. So what do I mean by the two sides of this equation? There's the generic approach and the specific approach, right? So you need to do things on a generic level as well as on a specific level. Now, what is generic and specific anyway, right? So what is generic prep? Generic prep is, stuff like, do you know the concepts of grammar? Do you know the concepts of geometry? Have you built your vocab? Are you familiar with test strategy? Do you know how to eliminate answers to get to the right answer? All of this is very general. All of this is information that is not the information of the test itself, but it's base information that will help you do the test. It's not actually going to be the case that, if your vocab is really good, you will automatically do well. But you do need to have the tool of a strong vocab in order to help you answer the questions, right? It's not like if you just have an abstract knowledge of geometry, you're going to be perfect at answering all of the geometry questions. But it is a tool that will help you on that front. So naturally, you do need to do some kind of generic prep, right? You do need to do some kind of prep on the front of, building up your conceptual understanding, building up your vocabulary, building up the tools that you need in order to take on the test, right? On the other hand, you can't just do generic prep. You also need to actually solve questions. You also need to think about, well, how do I solve a question? What are the kinds of traps that I can fall into? How do I manage my time when I'm taking a test, right? Do I know that if I practice an entire test that I'm able to keep my concentration and stamina and mental awareness up, right? You need to do that side of the equation as well, right? And I cannot tell you that generic prep is more important or specific prep is more important. You really simply cannot afford to ignore either one. you do have to consider everything possible on both sides, and you do have to make sure that you do enough of both generic and specific prep, right? So that's something worth keeping in mind, right, when you decide how you're going to approach the test. Now, to that end, right, it's a good idea to think about, well, what are the types of questions? What do you need to prepare yourself for, right? When it comes to quant, you kind of have 4 types of questions. You have quantitative comparison, which is, essentially gives you 2 quantities and it asks you to say which is bigger. I don't mean like it gives you 7 and 13 and tells you which is big, asks you to say which is bigger, right? It's more like, something with an equation within it itself. And then it asks you, okay, well, which one is bigger, right? And that's what you got to answer. Multiple choice answers, I think these are very familiar, right? You get 5 options, 1 is correct, yada, yada, yada. Single choice answers. Okay, so within multiple choice answers, you really have 2 categories. When we say you could have answers which have 5 options and just the 1 answer is correct, as could be described by single choice. Or you could have, an answer with multiple options and many of the options are correct. So you could have A, B, C, D, E, but A and C and D are all correct. Lastly, you could have data entry, which is essentially just saying you got to answer it yourself. You got to type in a number yourself, right? Now, ultimately, you're still going to have to know algebra. You're still going to have to know geometry. You're still going to have to know, a little bit of, arithmetic as well, right? You're still going to have to know all of these things, but these questions need to be approached in different ways and you need to think about that. On the verbal front, right, you also have 4 different types of questions. You have sentence equivalence, text completion, reading comprehension, and critical reasoning. So these 4 types of questions ultimately make up all the questions that you can get on the verbal section. Once again, building your vocabulary, being able to read, these are skills you got to build for everything, right? They're not specific. However, in order to answer these questions, you need to think specifically about what is the challenge of text completion, right? What is the challenge of data entry? What is the challenge of critical reasoning? How do I overcome this very specifically? So this is why, you do want to think on both a generic and a specific point of view. Now, what this leads us to is that our study plan must have or must address 4 major points. 1, you need to be building your vocab all the way through. This is generic level prep, and with vocab, ultimately, there's no fixed number. You can get any word from anywhere at any time, and the number of words in the English language, are almost endless, right? It's a crazy amount of words. So you need, in order to build your vocab, that's something you need to be doing constantly. There's no amount of prep that is like, oh, I did enough vocab. You can always do more. So you need to practice vocab on a regular basis and all the way through. You, of course, need to cover all of the concepts. So you need to know all of the base skills that you'll need in order to answer questions. You'll also need to practice questions regularly. Like we saw, right? There's the generic, there's also the specific. You also do need to practice questions. You also do need to try out questions so that you know whether you're answering them correctly or not. And lastly, you do need to do a practice test every now and then. This is important on both a generic and specific level, right? You're getting yourself acquainted with the test itself. You're getting yourself acquainted with the idea of eliminating options, with the structure and the content of the exam. And you're also getting yourself acquainted with answering questions, but doing so in a pressure cooker kind of scenario, right? So ultimately, if you address these 4 points, right, your study plan must address these 4 points. And if it does so, it will be an effective study plan. So what do you need? Vocab building all the way through, which is generic, cover all the concepts, also generic, regular practice of questions, obviously specific, spaced out practice tests, kind of specific, but with a bit of generic prep and ideas thrown in as well, right? And you need to do all of this in order to make sure that your prep is sound. Now, I do see that there's a question that's coming, so I'll answer that first, and I'll jump into the later part of this of this webinar. So somebody has asked, since there's been a change in the 2019 GRE, do you think that there should be any change in the strategy that we need to use for this? Okay. Vocabulary keeps on changing because it's connected with language. So the standard set of words that are in most books, will they suffice or not? All right. Now, firstly, the changes to the GRE this year are sort of very, very minimal. Okay, you do not need to worry too much about the approach. Ultimately, the approach that we're going to discuss is largely going to be the same. It's largely going to be fine, right? And that's something that you can follow through on. The other question that you've asked is also quite interesting. Vocabulary keeps changing because, what we consider an important word or not also keeps changing, right? What's interesting about that is, I'm going to give you an answer that's going to kind of be equivocating. And what does equivocating mean? It means to speak equally on both sides, right? So right, equal, and to vocate, to vocalize, right? To, voice out what you're saying, right? So equivocate, to speak equally on both sides. So I would say that, firstly, the words that tend to be GRE tested and tend to be sort of important, high standard words don't actually change too much. And the reason for this is that, ultimately the English language changes faster than these test takers or the test setters change in their approach with how they think about the language. So that's one thing, right? So that's worth keeping in mind. The other point, however, is that, although the words themselves don't change a great deal, ultimately studying the same words or having the same words for, to look up a list of words to study them is ultimately not very effective. And, the reason for this is that when you try to learn a list, like, how most test centers give you lists, you're only getting partial knowledge. And, at the end of the day, if you try to memorize 1,000 words that are kind of disjointed, how many of them are you really going to remember with the correct context anyway, right? Thirdly, when you learn definitions of words, well, you're learning definitions, but the GRE is not testing you on definitions. It's testing you on more of like a situational, contextual use of those words. So, even the approach that you take to learning words has got to be slightly different, right? So, good question. Good question. I think that's kind of interesting, to think about. But ultimately, what I would say is that the way that you approach your prep, even the way that you should approach learning words, is largely going to be the same, right? And speaking of learning words, let's dive in, right? So now that we know that we want to do these 4 things, let's talk about doing each one of these 4 things to make sure that we address all of them. Okay, so when it comes to building vocab, right, this is ultimately what's going to start your prep, and it's going to be something that you do all the way through. So you need to know how best to approach vocab. Now, ultimately, I will tell you 4 strategies here, that would work for vocab. And you may notice that none of these strategies are word lists. So like I said, right, if you just get a list of words, it's not very effective. It really does not work as well as you think it might. So, what I would recommend is using other strategies, right? And the other strategies are as follows. The first one of them is to use mnemonic devices. So what is a mnemonic device anyway, right? Besides being, a word with a funny spelling and a spelling bee type of word. A mnemonic device is one that is a tool to help us remember something that activates more than one part of our brain. So, like if you think about the flashcards that we saw at the start before we dove into this, the flashcards had a word, but it also had a picture associated with that word, and the situation being described matched both the picture and the meaning of the word. So that is on 3 fronts, you're getting a contextual sense of what that word means, right? And that's a good way to help you remember. You not only remember what the word itself means, you also understand better how to use it in the right situation. The next technique to help you learn words effectively is word roots. Whenever you see a new word, it's a good idea to ask yourself where that word came from. The reason for this is that ultimately, the English language borrows a lot of words from Latin, Greek, German, and French. Okay, the most words from these 4 languages, though it does borrow some words from others. Now, ultimately, what this means is that, you will have the same word from Latin or Greek or whatever, contributing to a variety of words in the English language. A good example of this would be, let's say the word, so when we spoke about, when I said the word equivocate, to speak equally on both sides. Now, the word vox, V-O-X, you may have heard of the news aggregator Vox as well. The word vox means voice in Latin. All right, now, from that, we get a lot of words in English that are associated with it. Vocal cords, the part of our body that helps us make a voice. right? That comes from that origin. To voice, the word voice itself comes from vox, right? To equivocate, right? That would be also from vox. To vocalize something, right? Also from the same root, right? To be very vocal about something, again from the same root. Now, these words are fairly similar to each other, fair enough, but it does demonstrate how a single root can lead you to many more words. In addition to this, because the root itself is common, you have a common thread by which to remember these words. So you're more likely to remember them, and you're more likely to make connections with these words to other words that you already know as well, because you already have that partial understanding and knowledge of what that word means. So word roots, right, is a very, very effective way. And there's a reason that I told you, right, that gladius meant sword in Latin, that, you know, equivocate is equal parts and vocalizing on equal parts, right? So the reason for that is to let you know that this is how word roots work. This is how you can build your vocab, right? Lastly, word groupings, right? So if, for example, you have a bunch of words related to words taken from Greek mythology, words that you would use at the hospital, words that are all associated with spending a lot of money, right? It helps to group your words like this, because ultimately you want to build not a list of words, but a web of words, right? You want to make a web of words with lots of connections, because that's how your brain understands things. How did you learn words to start with, right? Your brain was making a web of connections. That's what you want to do here as well. So you want to link words that are similar, right? And this helps consolidate your knowledge. Now, these are three specific techniques to learn vocab, and they're all very effective. There's one more generic technique to help you learn vocab as well, and that is to simply take what you really like doing and go very deep into it. Right? Now, I'll say this, right? I am not the most hardworking person in the world, and I do enjoy playing video games a lot. Now, I could say that there's so much in the way of vocab that I've learned from video games, right? You'd have these role-playing games that, you know, will tell you about strength, perception, endurance, luck, right? Agility. Okay, now these are not the hardest words in the world, but I learned them when I was 4 because I played a game which, you know, had these things. And it was because I put myself in that situation that I came across a new word, right? And that's what you essentially want to try to do. Another example of this, you know, when I read Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban for the first time, so, you know, I'm going to give you a spoiler, but it's been long enough, so don't blame me for it. You know, at the end of Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, there's a character who's revealed to be a werewolf, all right? His name is Remus Lupin, and it turns out he's a werewolf. And I remember 10-year-old me reading this and being like, oh my God, he's a werewolf. That's nuts. What a plot twist. This is so cool. But, you know, now when I look back at it, I'm like, well, this guy's name is Remus Lupin. So, you know, in the same way that the word feline has anything to do with cats and canine has anything to do with dogs, lupine has anything to do with wolves. In addition to this, you know, when you take the name Remus, so in Roman mythology, you have Romulus and Remus, who were 2 brothers who founded the city of Rome. And the interesting thing about Romulus and Remus is that they were raised by a wolf, right? So Romulus and Remus were raised by a wolf. So when this guy's name is Remus Lupin, the author is already telling you, J.K. Rowling is already telling you, hey, this guy's probably going to be a werewolf. You know, I gave him this name. It's kind of foreshadowing what's about to happen. And, you know, this is a great example of how, you know, even Harry Potter, right? Something that's absolutely just pop culture can teach you new words. It can teach you, give you a new and deeper understanding of what you already know on that front. So take the things that you like and really go deep into them. Right? This is ultimately a very effective way to learn words, because when you do this, you will automatically gain the right kind of context as well. All right. I do see, you know, another question is coming, which says, recently Manhattan Prep has launched Word of the Day series for GRE students. What do you have to say regarding this type of approach? I don't think Word of the Day is a bad idea. It's nice to help you keep yourself motivated as well. However, it is a small part of your prep. Ultimately, if you want to learn words en masse, and ultimately, you know, let's look at Word of the Day, right? So 8 weeks study plan, right? If you want to learn, let's say even extend that to 2 months. And let's even say that you're regular. right, with your preparation. I know that, you're not going to be regular, right? Sometimes you'll wake up on a Sunday and think, well, screw this. I don't want to learn anything now. So, what happens then, right? What do you do? Let's say if you learn a word every day, that's 60 words. Okay, that's not really enough. That's really not enough. It's a good thing to do. I won't say don't do it, right? If you're getting this content, and especially if you're getting it for free, that's fantastic, right? Go for it. But it shouldn't be the main way you learn words, right? So something to consider on the front of vocabulary. The next thing that you want to do is make sure that you understand the concepts. So the good news is that on the GRE, you're not trying to become a verbal scholar. You're not trying to become an English scholar who knows everything. All you're trying to do is learn specific concepts to help you answer specific questions. All you're trying to do is understand, well, okay, these are the kinds of concepts that I need to know, and this is what I need to do to get to that point. So here's a good example of a technical concept. All right, so what I'm going to share with you is called the rhyme technique or the RISE technique, depending on how you want to call it. But essentially, right, whenever you get a sentence equivalence or text completion question, and don't worry, we'll look at such a question in the next slide. But whenever you get one of these types of questions, all you need to do is follow this conceptual approach and you'll be fine. So you want to read the sentence, you want to identify keywords, right? So subject and the information and the important stuff that the sentence is trying to communicate to you. You then want to come up with your own word to fill in the blank. And lastly, eliminate the options that don't work. Right? Now, getting yourself familiar with this process and understanding how to use it right, and maybe understanding some things about, well, how to synthesize something properly. How do I identify the subject of a sentence? How do I eliminate options, right? There could be a little bit more to it than what I've just told you right here. But ultimately, this is one technical concept. And this one technical concept should not take you really more than like 20 minutes to half an hour to understand, right? Or maybe, if you have the benefit of sitting in a class, well, maybe you get like a whole hour to understand something like this. But ultimately, it's one simple concept. What you then need to do is use that concept to actually practice questions, right? So we saw vocab building, we saw covering concepts. Now we need to practice questions using the concepts that we've learned. So let's try that. Although the provision of food to wild chimpanzees has made them less blank and easier to study, it was found to blank their normal social patterns, thereby rendering the implications of the study blank. Okay, so read the sentence, right? Then we want to identify the subject and we want to identify words that help us out. So firstly, I do see the although. And the word although is generally, although something good, something bad happened. Although something bad, it was not a problem because something good happened, right? Generally, when you start with an although, you have a switch in tone. So although the provision of food to wild chimpanzees made them less blank and easier to study. So although good thing, it was found to blank their normal social patterns, thereby rendering the implications of the study blank. Second part should be something bad, right? So there we go. So we know that that's the meaning that we're trying to communicate, right? That's what we're looking to put forward. So now let's take a look at, what the words say, what might go into the first blank. So the provision of food made them less blank and easier to study. I guess you could say it made them less wild, or it made them less shy. It made them more willing to interact with humans. So it made them less unwilling to interact with humans, right? I think that's what we're kind of looking for. So let's take a look at the options. Less interesting. Well, it doesn't make sense that they'd be less interesting because that has nothing to do with being easier to study and that has nothing to do with interaction with humans. So let's go ahead and say that interesting doesn't work here. Bashful. Now, what does it mean to be bashful anyway? Who knows? Let's move on to the next word, right? Manageable. Made them less manageable? No, it made them more manageable and easier to study, right? So less manageable is out because it's the opposite of what we're looking for. So now, even though we didn't know the meaning of the word bashful, we still could get to the answer bashful. Incidentally, bashful is shy, right? It's also one of the names of the 7 dwarves in Snow White and the 7 dwarves. But yeah, to be bashful is to be shy. So they were less shy, they were less hidden, and they came out and they became easier to study. Great, right? Now we can move on to blank 2. It was found to blank their normal social patterns. Now we know that something negative happened, right? So negatively affect. Promote the normal social patterns? No, that's positive. So we're certainly out with that. Disrupt. Okay, well, that could be negatively affecting, right? Disrupt something is to throw something out of whack, to make something, not as straightforward as it used to be. Okay, so we can keep that in the mix. Reinforce the normal social patterns. When you reinforce something, you make that thing more itself. If we're reinforcing normal social patterns, that means even more so, the normal social patterns are being done. So that doesn't make sense either. We need to move on then to it being disrupt. Great, so let's see what else happens. Thereby rendering the implications of the study blank. So it disrupted their normal social patterns. Thereby the implications of the study were not as valuable as they could have been, right? They were not as, not as useful as they could have been because it wasn't their normal social patterns. Okay, incontrovertible. Well, what the hell does incontrovertible mean? Can't really eliminate it yet, can we? Dubious. Okay, so what does the word dubious mean? The word dubious is something that is like that you're unsure about it. It's something that is open to doubt. And that's the origin, right? We see D-U-B, right? So dubious is something is dubious if it is open to doubt, if it's open to being doubted. Okay, so rendering the implications to be kind of dubious, right? The implications can be doubted. Yeah, we can doubt the implications because they're kind of negative. They kind of don't really add up. Okay, could be that. Corroborative. So what does corroborative mean anyway, right? To corroborate something is to back something up with evidence or to back something up with another person's, point of view. That's not really true either because we're looking for something specifically negative. Okay, so let's come back to incontrovertible then. Now, again, something that is incontrovertible if you do not have evidence to convert somebody's point of view. So when we say incontrovertible evidence, what that would mean is that's evidence that cannot be refuted, evidence that cannot be denied. If the implications of the study are incontrovertible, that would mean that the implications of the study cannot be refuted in any way, it cannot be attacked in any way. The implications of the study are absolutely perfect. But that's not what we're looking for, right? In fact, we're trying to say that it's going to be something negative. We can go ahead and get rid of incontrovertible. And the right answer is dubious. So the correct answer to this question would have been bashful, disrupt, dubious. And you have to get all three right to get this question right. Now, what we did here, right, is all well and good. Like you can solve this question and maybe if you're solving it, not while explaining it and you're just solving it yourself, you could maybe even solve it in the conditions that the test requires of you. But all of this is not useful unless you can analyze the question after. You can get some important takeaway after. One takeaway that I could give you from this is that, when we solved blank one, even if we didn't know what bashful meant, we could still figure out that the right answer would be bashful, right? We knew it wasn't interesting or manageable. So what that reveals, or the takeaway that tells you is that, look, you don't have to know every single word given, right? It helps, but you don't have to know every single word. All you need to know is enough to help you eliminate. All you need to have is enough knowledge to give you a sense that, hey, this word could work or this word could not work, right? Another takeaway, because I'm being so generous here, is that the word dubious, right? I explained how that comes from doubt. This is a good example of how maybe you didn't know what the word dubious meant, but you've seen the word doubt before, and you're like, yeah, dubious, doubt, okay, maybe this dubious means doubtable, right? Which is not a word. Dubious is the actual word. But, it could be something to do with doubt. Okay, fine, right? And this is a good example, again, then, of how learning vocab through root words, learning vocab through making connections rather than simply learning a list will help you get to the kind of vocab knowledge that you need in order to answer these questions. So 2 takeaways here, right? We reiterated and reinforced the importance of studying words with context. And we saw how, while it's important to know while it's good to know every word, it's not essential. And you can kind of get there even without that, right? And that is ultimately what we learned from this. So ultimately, right, what we're doing is we want to build vocab all the way through. We want to cover the concepts. We want to practice questions regularly. But when we practice questions regularly, we need to make sure that what we're focusing on is the analysis on those questions. Right? Well, it's not just that, hey, could I do this question right or wrong? I did this question right, so fair enough. But okay, I did this question right. What did I learn from it? Or let's say you got it wrong. I got it wrong. What could I learn from it? What was the mistake that I made? What was the nature? And it's not just, oh, I picked incontrovertible and it's dubious. What can I learn about how to not pick such an option again? Right? What can I learn about where my energy and focus needs to go? Right? All of that information is ultimately going to help you get into the right position. So it's not just doing the questions. You want to spend as much time analyzing the questions as doing them. So let's come up with a template for study, right? That, I'm going to call a Goldilocks template, right? And why Goldilocks? Because, it's the template that I consider to be just right, not too many, not too few, just right. Just like the story of Goldilocks. So, the underlying idea behind this whole template is we don't want you to be studying all day, right? Do you want to be studying all day? No, you don't, right? Like maybe you've told yourself, yeah, I need to do it because, hey, I need to be the best. No, you need to get the right kind of score. But if you get the right kind of score by studying 2 hours a day, that's better than getting the right kind of score studying 7 hours a day, right? You have all that extra time to yourself. So, we talk about an 8-week study plan. And of course, if you want to compress that further, you will have to study more. If you have a bit more time, you could maybe take it a little bit more lax even. But, the main point is this, right? Studying all day is not effective, right? At a certain point, your brain doesn't take in the information anymore because it's super boring, right? So what do you need to do instead? You need to do enough. So you need to not do too many, but not do too few either. You need to do enough to make sure that you hit all of those base points that we spoke about. So what do you need to do? Vocab prep, which we discussed. Concept prep, we discussed the concept. Question solving prep, we solved the question. And most importantly, question analysis, which is what we did after solving the question. You do need to do all 4 of these things on a regular basis, right? So how does that come out to be? You want to spend about half an hour on vocab, right? Even if it's like 20 minutes, that's fine, right? I put half an hour as like a max number. In all these cases, I put it like, something on the higher side, right? Half an hour for vocab would be ideal. If you can't do it, do 20 minutes, do 15 minutes, but do something, right? Make sure you do some vocab. All right. Then early on in your prep, you want to spend about half an hour covering and revising concepts, because you're trying to learn that concept for the first time, right? We covered this concept in like 10 minutes. But if you're learning it for the first time and you want to learn how to apply it properly as well, and like do a bunch of things with it, yeah, it could take you like half an hour. So that's also all right. That's also cool. Go for it, right? As you progress with your prep, you don't need to come back and learn the RISE technique all over again. You just need to recap the RISE technique and maybe, something that could make the RISE technique hard, or a trap that you could fall into while using it, which you shouldn't fall into, right? It's just recapping that stuff. So, early on, maybe you'll be spending about half an hour a day doing this. Down the line, you really don't want to be spending more than like, 10, 15 minutes tops. Now, when it comes to doing questions, remember that it's quality over quantity. Don't just solve questions. We have people who say, yeah, I can solve 50 questions a day. I can solve 100 questions a day. I'm prepared to study 6 hours a day. I'm prepared to study 8 hours a day. And I'm there like, hey man, like chill out a little bit, right? You don't want to solve questions just for the sake of saying I solve questions. Because what happens is this. If you just solve questions in bulk, you may start to understand the pattern of the test better simply because you've solved so many questions, and you may get slightly better. But you've not learned from your mistakes. So you've not fixed your mistakes. So you won't necessarily get that much of a better score. So you're not looking to just solve questions for the sake of it. You want to pick a number of questions that will allow you to do deep analysis. So what that means is that, if you're going to do 50 questions in a day, you've got to be able to analyze all 50. And you can't analyze all 50, right? Why not? Because, by the time you analyze question 1, you won't even remember doing question 1. You did 50 questions in the meantime. So the amount that I would say is not more than 20. Never more than 20, right? It could even be 15 questions in a day. And I think that's also fine. I would say 20 is probably a good idea for a higher peak because there are 20 questions in a verbal section or 20 questions in the quant section, right? Just for that reason. But really, not more than 20 questions, not more than half an hour doing the questions, right? That should be the peak amount of time. And always, always, always analyze your answers, right? If you're correct, you learn what you did right and what you want to keep doing. If you're wrong, you learn what you're expected to do instead. Remember that an analysis of the correct answer is like an opportunity for you to walk through the brain of the GRE. The GRE is literally telling you, oh, this is how our brain works. This is how we reward answers. This is what we think is right. This is what we think is wrong. That's all useful information. right? So ultimately, you always want to analyze your answers. And in fact, if you spend half an hour doing questions, you want to spend at least half an hour analyzing the answers, right? Simple as that. If you spend 20 minutes doing the questions, you want to, if you spend 30 minutes doing the questions, you want to spend 30 minutes analyzing them. If you spend 20 minutes doing questions, you want to spend 20 to 30 minutes analyzing. Make sure that analyzing questions is just as important a part of your study plan as is solving questions themselves, right? Ultimately, let's add this up. Half an hour on vocab, half an hour revising concepts, half an hour doing questions, half an hour analyzing questions. And all of those are kind of on the high side. Really, what does this add up to? 2 hours a day of prep, right? If you feel like you want to go really, really hard, now we saw, maybe you have to do this for verbal and for quant. Maybe it'll come up to about 3 hours, right? Because whichever section you're better at, you won't spend as much time. This is for the section that is harder, right? This is for, let's say, I'm giving the example of the verbal section, but yeah, this is for the section that's a bit more challenging. Otherwise, an hour should be enough. So really, like at the very, very, very most, 3 hours of prep in a day. And I know that 3 hours is a lot. I know that I was a notoriously lazy person who had a hard time studying 3 hours a day. So I acknowledge that that's a lot. But, the good news is that that's all you got to do. You may have friends who study 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 9 hours a day, 6 hours a day. And, you look at them and think, shit, I'm never going to study that much. I'm just never going to get to that point. So why even try? It's super demotivating. But, if you tell yourself, hey, look, okay, 3 hours is a lot, but okay, I can at least do 2. I can at least get to that point. You've done a good job. You don't need to do 6 hours. You need to do 2 hours that you get a lot out of, right? That's ultimately what is going to be the best way to go about your prep. So we looked at all of this. Now let's try to put this all together into a plan, right, across 8 weeks, right? What are you going to do from week 0 to 8, right? How does that work? So here's your plan. On the verbal side of things, right, you need to do vocab prep from week 0 to 8. You don't have a choice there. You got to do your prep all the way through. Vocab is a constant from start to finish. Understanding the types of questions and the approach for them. Now, this I would say is learning the concepts, right? This is the concept heavy stuff. Right? At this point, you're still doing questions, right? You're not doing questions, right? When we say understand the types of questions and the approach, you do understand it by practice. But at this stage, you're still focusing a little bit more on the concepts, right? So you spend the first 4 weeks working on the concepts, right? Understanding how to use the RISE technique, understanding how an SE question works and how to solve it, understanding how to read a passage when you're reading for RC, right? All of this stuff is going to be a bit more of your focus in the first 4 weeks. In the next 4 weeks, it's going to be prep all the way through, right? It's just going to be doing practice of questions, not so much, right? Like we said, it'll come down to maybe 10 minutes or so of actual concepts, much more time spent just doing practice and doing understanding, right? So that's really what we're looking for there. Now, on the quant front, right, do a basic mathematics review across the first 2 weeks. Weeks 3, 4, 5, 6, you do what we described in verbal 0 to 4, and the higher level practice is only in the final 2 weeks. If you struggle more with quant, maybe you'll want to take a little bit more time, or maybe you'll want to, do a bit more time for review, a little bit less time for, breaking down the question types and approaches. But, this is ultimately a pretty effective plan, right? You just need to make sure you know the concepts that you learned, right? There's nothing beyond class 10 level. So at the very least, you'll be at least sort of familiar with the ideas. Focusing on the strategic approach to the questions, that's something that you then move into. And at the final stage, you dive into higher level practice in the final 2 weeks. Now, the last thing that I'd spoken about when I said that what needs to be addressed in your approach to testing, in your approach to, towards building a study plan, is that you do also need to think about practice tests. Practice tests, give you a good opportunity to, one, understand how your time management will work for the test itself. 2, get you acquainted with solving questions in that pressure cooker situation and building the stamina that you need in order to do it. 3, give you a vague, rough prediction of where you're at in your prep, right? Tells you a bit about your strengths and weaknesses. So it does all of these things, and you need to do them at regular intervals to make sure that you are you're ahead of the game, right? So that you know where you start, right? So you know where you stand. So ultimately, I recommend doing 3 practice tests. Do one to start with. People always say, no, I want to do the material first because I don't want to see myself getting a bad score. I know that if I do a test at the start of my prep, I'll get a shit score, and I don't want to see that. Who cares? It's a prep test. Who cares if your score is shit to start with? In fact, it's good if you know that. You need to know that you're at a 290 so that you know what you can do to improve on that 290. If you don't even know what to improve on, how are you going to do it properly? So you've got to take a practice test to start with. After 4 weeks, right, at this point, you're probably done with your verbal concepts, you're progressing through on the quant concepts, a good time to take a practice test, right? Good time to see whether, you've made some progress, good time to see, what has been the change from the time you started to now. And that's why it's good to take a test to start with. You'll certainly have made progress in these 4 weeks. You want to measure that progress. You want to be sure that, hey, okay, I actually got something out of this. Then you want to take a practice test after 6 weeks, right? Just to make sure that, you're in the groove and that you're constantly, sort of ready, right? At this point, you want to get more in the zone with taking tests. In fact, I feel like I've missed one out here. Take one 2 days before the exam, right? So this is in week 8, right? Don't take one the day before the exam because you'll always feel like whatever score you get then, you're locked into it. Take one 2 days before and just chill out the day before, right? Just so that you know, hey, okay, these are the things that I got to think about. These are the things that I want to keep in my head to brush up on, right? The last thing that we said we talk about is also the material from which you want to practice these questions, the material from which you want to, understand the concepts. Now, to understand the concepts, obviously, since I'm a representative of Crack Verbal, and I have personally had a hand in developing the verbal course, I'm always going to tell you, hey, man, you got to check out our verbal course. That's the best way to learn the concepts. I mean, I made it. So I trust my ability and I trust, the way that we've thought about putting it all together. But when it comes to finding questions, where do you want to do your questions from, right? Not all questions are created equal. Some people are trying to make GRE questions, but they're not actually making GRE questions. So ultimately, there are 2 sources that I recommend. In addition, of course, to Crack Verbal material, right? This is assuming that you're taking up our course and that you're going to look through our material anyway. In addition to that, you want to look at ETS's own material, ETS's own sample questions, right? ETS's own guide. That's a good source. And lastly, there's this book from Manhattan Prep called the 5-pound book, right? It says 5 LB, that's 5 pounds. I know the metric system is super weird, right? I don't know how LB becomes pounds, but it is what it is. The 5-pound book, it has a bunch of challenging questions on verbal and quant. I recommend maybe, after 4 weeks, once you move up to the next level, that's a good time to start doing the 5 LB, the 5-pound questions, right? Ultimately, these are all the sources that you'll need. Don't go looking for other sources. Instead, figure out how to make these sources work for you effectively, right? And that's pretty much it. That's an 8-week plan, right? The last thing that I want to say is this. I said that the 8-week plan is adaptable, right? Now, this is a plan that involves studying 2 hours a day, maybe 3, right? If you're doing both verbal and quant together. If you plan to do this over 3 months instead, well, then you never really need to study more than an hour and a half to 2 a day, right? And you can stretch everything out proportionally, right? This would become weeks 0 to 6. This would become weeks 6 to 12, right? If it's a 3-month plan, right? So you can adapt and change this up. I would say that 6 weeks is probably the shortest amount of time you can give yourself. Don't give yourself less than 6 weeks. But ultimately, you can do it with 6 weeks, you can do it with 8 weeks, you can do it with 12 weeks, you can do it with 4 months, you can do it with half a year. All of them work. It's just taking this structure and adapting it back and forth. Maybe a good idea for you to take a screenshot of this slide as well, right? Good to keep this as a template in mind so you can work through it. All right, hopefully that was enough time for you to take a screenshot. I think that we can wrap this session up. It took us an hour and 15 minutes, right? I'm kind of impressed with that since we started with the content an hour ago. So, I want to thank all of you for, being participative, for answering the polls, for, just getting involved. I'll end the session by answering questions that you send in, right? I see that somebody says that they're struggling with permutations and combinations and what book should they consult? Once again, I would always recommend our content and our material. However, in addition to that, right, like I said, you want to try practicing questions. Do a question on permutations and combinations, and more than anything else, look up all of the wrong answers, right? So let's say you pick answer option A, and answer option D is the right answer. You want to understand why A, B, C, and E are wrong, right? If you understand that, then you get tips and tricks about what not to do. So if you're talking about a which book, yeah, even the books with the questions in them, because the explanations that they give you, like I said, right, a walking tour through their brain. It gives you an understanding of what it is that they're exactly trying to communicate, right? I see that no other questions have come up in this time, and there were not that many of you here anyway. But really, props to all of you who came in, right? Thank you so much for attending this session. Hopefully, it was useful for you. Hopefully, you feel like you have a little bit of a sense of how to approach your study plan for the GRE altogether. Thanks a lot. If you have any further questions, I recommend getting in touch with us at support@crackbubble.com, right? So, you know what, I'm just going to put that on the chat. So maybe you can copy paste that effectively, support@crackbubble.com, right? And then you can also get in touch with us about, getting access to more content, signing up for our sessions. We also do personal tutoring, which is not something that people do very often. So, and we find that that's been pretty effective as well. So you can take a look at all of those options and what's available on that front, right? So that's pretty much it, right? Take care, have a wonderful day, and hopefully I will see some of you as students down the line as well. That's me wrapping things up and signing off. Take care and have a wonderful night. Good night.